The most potent paradox within human deception is that the architecture of a profound moral failure often depends entirely upon the outward appearance of stability. Neil Entwistle had diligently constructed such an image, presenting himself as a devoted husband, a new father, and a confident man who had led his small family on a one-way flight across the Atlantic for the promise of a superior life in America. This initial anomaly, the discrepancy between the claimed ambition and the unsupported reality, was the very psychological mechanism that allowed his quiet, internal collapse to proceed completely unnoticed by those who had placed their fundamental trust in him. The danger was structurally embedded in the presentation of normalcy. The physical relocation of the family in late 2005 immediately activated a critical environmental constraint, shifting the entire weight of the fresh start onto Neil's unsupported financial promises and creating a vacuum of external accountability. Settling into the quiet, respectable town of Hopkinton, Massachusetts, placed them geographically and socially far from the established support systems, routines, and oversight of their prior lives in the United Kingdom. This isolation magnified the core problem. Neil had no job, yet he consistently claimed he did, manufacturing vague narratives about internet ventures, complex stock trading, and nascent entrepreneurial projects. This situational pressure ensured that the only witness to his gathering financial crisis was Neil himself. The individual error that defined the early stage was the conscious choice to replace problem-solving with calculated illusion, requiring an immense, continuous effort devoted to emotional and informational segregation. While Rachel worked as a teacher, focusing on the care of their infant daughter, Lillian, Neil's finances were in a state of terminal decline, with bank accounts nearly empty and the promised work remaining a pure fiction. He refused to disclose this existential situation to Rachel or her family, choosing instead the profound helplessness of denial over the momentary vulnerability of simple confession. This refusal to share reality resulted in a parallel existence, immediately satisfying the audience's curiosity by identifying the exact behavioral pattern that precedes catastrophe. This secretive behavior led directly to a systemic inversion of his role within the home, where the majority of his energy was channeled into private, hidden digital spaces that stood in stark contrast to his public image. Digital forensic analysis later confirmed long hours spent on his laptop, systematically seeking out adult websites and escort services, often using dating sites and adult forums under false, constructed identities.
Before we go on, a small favor, please subscribe to the channel. It helps a lot. Thank you, and let's continue with the story.
This shadow life, built on immediate fantasy and sustained evasion, provided a critical partial understanding, demonstrating that his fundamental impulse was self-preservation and emotional escape, even while maintaining the quiet, focused domestic scene with Rachel and Lillian in the adjoining rooms. The logical progression of this shame-driven avoidance created a terrifying future vector where his thoughts demonstrably shifted toward violent action as a mechanism of final erasure. This trajectory from isolated digital avoidance to physical elimination was meticulously tracked through his browser history, which included repeated searches for phrases like "how to kill people," instructions on firearm acquisition, and specific queries about the mechanics of murder. This established a structural pattern of escalating desperation, linking the days of searching for escort services and death instructions, and providing the audience with the reversal that the ultimate collapse was not an emotional eruption, but a progressive, cold calculation. The moral implication that emerges from the evidence is how a social and cultural environment can enable this kind of polished blindness, where the management of external image is prioritized over genuine moral responsibility and human connection. Analysts observed that Neil's entire behavioral template was driven by the intense fear of financial and social disgrace. The dread of being exposed as a failure was a demonstrably stronger motivator than the instinct to protect his family. This psychological defense mechanism, the prioritization of control over care, was the shield that delayed detection and allowed his duplicitous behavior to proceed until the inevitable, tragic moment of exposure finally arrived. This deep analysis transforms emotional confusion into insight, where the chaos is reduced to a pattern of cause and effect. The execution of the final act relied on a final, definitive individual error of preparation, the specific acquisition of the weapon used in the killings. Investigators proved that the .22 caliber handgun was stolen from his father-in-law's home during a recent visit, establishing that the intent to act had been formed and the means of lethal control secured well in advance of the actual event. This factual detail serves as a powerful controlled uncertainty, overturning any claim of spontaneity or accident by confirming deliberate, premeditated preparation and concealment. The corridor of intent, traced from financial panic to the theft of the instrument, shows a man moving with methodical precision toward a calculated end. The psychological mechanics behind the financial avoidance reveal the extreme cognitive load of maintaining the lie of prosperity, an effort that exceeded the actual work of generating income. The energy dedicated to constant evasion became a psychological mechanism of exhaustion, a critical factor in the subsequent breakdown of moral judgment. The mental strain of managing two entirely separate realities, the affluent, aspirational narrative communicated abroad versus the bankrupt reality of his bank statement, created an internal fracture. This anomaly clarifies that the murderer was not merely a passive liar, but a man profoundly trapped in a continuous high-stakes performance where exposure meant the total annihilation of his constructed self-image. When Rachel and Lillian were discovered on or about January 20th, 2006, inside their home, the scene was one of profound, misleading quiet, a detail that immediately countered any possibility of a struggle or external forced entry. They were found together in the bed they shared, both having been shot at close range, Rachel in the head and Lillian in the torso, suggesting a controlled, intimate, and domestic act of violence. The total absence of defensive wounds or signs of alarm in the minutes leading up to the crime serves as a critical environmental constraint on the final hour, pointing with chilling accuracy back to the source of the danger. A figure trusted completely, who used the very intimacy of the home as a mechanism for elimination.
Before we go on, a small favor, please subscribe to the channel. It helps a lot. Thank you, and let's continue with the story.
The most profound individual error in the aftermath was Neil Entwistle's decision to execute a final, strategic disappearance rather than seeking any form of help or reporting the horror he later claimed to have found. He boarded a plane back to London within 24 hours of the killings without informing Rachel's family, calling 911, or reporting the deaths to any authority figure. His non-action became an action of self-preservation, a structured omission designed explicitly to delay accountability. His later story that he had found the bodies, panicked, and fled because he feared being blamed was immediately undermined by the fact that he silently booked an overseas flight and deliberately deleted crucial data from his computer before leaving. The subsequent systemic inversion was confirmed by his composed and quiet demeanor upon landing in the UK, where he returned to his parents' home and actively maintained the illusion of normalcy. This ability to compartmentalize, to function rationally and communicate calmly while an investigation into the murder of his family unfolded, was demonstrably not the dazed numbness of shock. It was a practiced, desperate strategy of control, exemplified by records showing him once again seeking out escort services while claiming to be overwhelmed by trauma. This confirmed the curiosity of the investigators. The emotional chaos he claimed was a profound fabrication, maintained through the entire logistical process of international flight and return. The future vector of the case became the protracted legal battle for extradition from London to Massachusetts, which systematically dismantled the remnants of Neil's self-constructed narrative. The complexity of the process required the meticulous assembly of verifiable data, phone records, financial logs, airline manifests, and digital forensic reports, to build a single, unified narrative of premeditation and flight. This process provided the audience with the partial understanding that justice operates not on emotion, but on the relentless aggregation of small, cold facts, proving that the motive was not sudden rage, but a desperate, final attempt to escape the consequence of his own deceit. The moral implication that emerges from the investigation is the devastating ripple effect of betrayal on those who had extended the most support. Rachel's family, who had welcomed him, supported his immigration, and provided financial assistance, faced a profound cognitive dissonance. Their innate trust created a temporal lag, a period where they struggled to reconcile the gentle husband they knew with the unfolding horror. This trauma of helplessness found resolution only through the systematic presentation of the evidence, which allowed them to understand how their trust had been exploited as a mechanism of the killer's operational structure. The psychological mechanics that drove the escape attempt were rooted in a belief that physical distance could erase moral and legal responsibility, a profound act of self-deception that defined his post-crime behavior. The journey across the Atlantic was not a panicked flight, but a calculated effort to regain control of the narrative by placing himself within a familiar social structure, his parents' home, where he wrongly believed the pressure of the Massachusetts investigation would feel abstract and distant. This attempt to substitute geography for justice was an insight into his deep-seated psychological immaturity, where adult problems were solved not by confrontation, but by evasion and retreat. When considering the immediate prelude to the violence, an unnoticed environmental constraint was the total reliance of the family unit on Neil's self-proclaimed status as the financial provider. The new life in America was structurally dependent on a fictional income, making Rachel's unawareness of the debt a critical vulnerability. Had the financial truth been known, the family's proximity to danger would have been immediately recognized. The illusion of security created a protective barrier around the perpetrator, while simultaneously preventing any external intervention that might have surfaced the financial panic before it became lethal. This reversal shows that the domestic peace was not a sign of health, but a symptom of the deadly equilibrium maintained by the central lie. The individual error of the pre-crime phase was not merely lying about his job, but the deliberate, escalating pattern of debt accumulation through credit card fraud and other means that created an unserviceable debt load. Records confirmed his habit of moving funds and opening new lines of credit to cover immediate shortfalls, a cycle of financial self-sabotage that reached a terminal phase in Hopkinton. His omission of these mounting crises blinded Rachel to the fact that their immediate economic survival was completely contingent on a series of financial maneuvers that were rapidly running out of road. This established a controlled uncertainty for the audience, revealing the true scale of the risk Rachel unknowingly lived under. This level of financial desperation drove a systemic inversion where the marriage itself was functionally dissolved long before the physical act of violence. What began as a partnership built on shared future goals had inverted into a relationship where Rachel was structurally dependent on a man actively plotting both his and their escape from a situation he created. The theft of the father-in-law's weapon represented the moment the facade of the provider fully collapsed, replaced by the identity of the elimination strategist. The relationship had been reduced, in his mind, to a physical obstacle standing in the way of his personal escape from shame. demanding a decisive, final action to restore his singular control. The moral implication for the broader community focuses on the pathology of appearance. The Entwistle family occupied the middle ground of suburban life, characterized by a presumption of good faith and quiet stability, which made the internal collapse difficult to process. The crime forced a confrontation with the uncomfortable reality that even the most benign, ordinary settings can host extreme moral failure. This realization provided the anomaly of the case for the public, that the structural evil was not loud or visibly monstrous, but rather quiet, self-contained, and structurally reinforced by the very invisibility of suburban routine. The future vector of the evidence collection focused intensely on the digital footprint, transforming ephemeral data into permanent, legally binding proof. Forensic experts were able to recover much of the deleted search history, which detailed his specific inquiries into the mechanics of the crime, the necessary materials, and methods of disposal. This was not a general query about violence. It was a focused, technical investigation into the operational requirements of murder. The success of this digital reconstruction provides curiosity about the evolving nature of human accountability, where a digital trail, once created, cannot be truly erased, ensuring that data eventually overcomes denial. Returning to the psychological mechanics of the violence, the controlled nature of the crime scene suggests a profound lack of empathy, a final act of transactional logic rather than emotional overflow. The violence was executed with the same methodical, self-contained effort he used to manage his finances and his digital secrets. This confirmed the partial understanding that the motivation was structural, to eliminate the financial consequence and the familial commitment that prevented his desired escape, rather than personal or relational. He did not kill them out of hatred, but out of a desperate, cold need for self-preservation from financial shame. The environmental constraint of time pressure played a critical, near-miss role in the final days. The mounting financial deadlines, the imminent exposure of his empty accounts, and the impossibility of securing more credit created a psychological bottleneck that compressed his decision-making timeline. Investigators theorized that the confluence of these financial stressors with the constant presence of his family, representing the very responsibilities he was failing, forced the decision. This near-miss tension highlights the structural forces at play. The lie was minutes away from natural implosion, and the violence was a frantic, last-ditch preemptive strike against imminent shame. The individual error of the post-crime period was his communication with Rachel's family after he fled. Neil maintained the facade of the distraught, confused victim who had simply panicked, but his actions, the immediate sale of certain assets and the careful phrasing of his communications, were noted for their calculated ambiguity. He attempted to manage the information flow from afar, but every attempt to sound confused only served to emphasize the lack of genuine emotion, creating a profound dissonance for those trying to believe his narrative. This omission of authentic shock became a primary piece of reversal evidence used against him during the extradition process. This ongoing attempt to control the narrative from London represented a systemic inversion of the judicial process itself, where a perpetrator actively sought to use the distance and complexity of international law as a shield against the facts. His legal defense hinged on the idea that the evidence was too circumstantial and that the speed of his flight was merely panic, not guilt. This effort provided insight into the structural defenses of the morally bankrupt. They often rely on the assumption that complex systems will protect them from simple moral truths, attempting to substitute legal maneuvering for ethical responsibility. The enduring moral implication of the case is the chilling lesson in human vulnerability, that awareness is the only reliable defense against calculated deceit. The most profound satisfaction comes from the cognitive mastery that allows the viewer to reduce the chaos of betrayal to the pattern of deception reinforced by silence. trust misused by concealment, escape disguised as logic. The final closure is not in understanding Neil Entwistle, but in understanding the pattern itself. This reinforces the controlled uncertainty that while he is incarcerated, the mechanism he employed, the building of a mask to conceal failure, remains an active, persistent danger in the wider culture, waiting for its next place to hide. The pattern always exists, ready to be activated under the right environmental and psychological pressure, and the cost of complacency is always catastrophic. The psychological distance Entwistle maintained from the reality of his actions was so profound that it constituted a fundamental psychological mechanism of dissociation, allowing him to observe his own terrible circumstances from an intellectual remove. He was functionally operating as a character in a narrative he was desperately trying to control, rather than as a moral agent responsible for real human consequences. This clinical detachment is what allowed him to search for escort services and flight details with the same calm precision with which he searched for murder methods. This level of emotional emptiness provides the final anomaly for the viewer. The violence was not a sign of a man breaking down, but a final, grotesque attempt to remain systematically intact. The environmental constraint of the initial financial arrangement must be meticulously detailed to understand the foundation of the lie. The couple arrived in the United States reliant on a modest teaching salary earned by Rachel, while Neil's claimed income was entirely fictional. This imbalance meant that every domestic expenditure, every purchase for their daughter, and every monthly rent payment was a slow, agonizing erosion of their already limited capital. The air of prosperity he maintained was not just a lie to his family back home. It was a daily, domestic fabrication that forced Rachel to participate unknowingly in the systematic depletion of their reserves. This escalating economic tension was a silent clock counting down to the moment of inevitable exposure. The cumulative individual error of the pre-crime period was the conscious decision to purchase the plane ticket for his flight back to London before the bodies were discovered by authorities and before any supposed panic could have set in. Evidence showed he had secured his exit route, finalizing the logistical details of his solo departure, while Rachel and Lillian were still alive or immediately after the crime, proving the flight was not a reaction to trauma, but a planned part of the operational sequence. This curiosity about the timing confirms that the act of elimination was structurally connected to the act of escape. This immediate post-crime flight created a systemic inversion of the expected behavior of a victim or a witness. His total failure to use the primary systems designed for emergency response, calling 911, contacting local police, or even reaching out to nearby family members, acted as a self-incriminating firewall. He bypassed every logical and moral checkpoint, substituting a self-serving, covert exit strategy for any form of transparent communication or civic duty. This pattern of evasion provided the partial understanding that his primary allegiance was not to the truth or his family, but solely to the preservation of his own legal and social standing. The future vector of the case is the ongoing study of how social media and email communication, the very tools of modern connection, were repurposed as instruments of sustained deceit. Neil used email not to convey reality, but to manage and sculpt the perception of his family's successful new life, sending carefully curated updates designed to preempt suspicion. These digital communications, which were recovered as evidence, demonstrated a methodical, almost artistic commitment to the lie. This analysis offers the reversal that in the digital age, the tools of transparency can be weaponized for sophisticated, long-term deception, making the remote observer the most easily manipulated target. The moral implication of his defense, which subtly attempted to imply that Rachel might have been depressed or that an outside killer was involved, was a final, cold act of betrayal aimed at mitigating his own moral responsibility. This attempt to deflect blame onto the victim or into the realm of external chaos confirmed the insight that Neil's core motivation was fixed on self-exoneration. He was incapable of absorbing the consequences of his actions, seeking to impose his structural dishonesty onto the very process of justice. This final, profound refusal to accept accountability solidified the psychological portrait of a man entirely devoid of moral gravity. The psychological mechanics of the near-miss moments must be fully explored to understand the constant tension Neil lived under. There were instances when Rachel's parents, sensing a vague unease in the communications, offered to visit or inquired more closely about the new business ventures. Each of these inquiries was a momentary threat to the illusion, forcing Neil to deploy high-pressure persuasive levers, calm reassurances, vague promises, and gentle deflections to maintain the operational distance. These small acts of concealment were his daily work, consuming the energy that should have been dedicated to actual employment. This provides the final controlled uncertainty, emphasizing how close the truth came to being uncovered, only to be turned aside by the simple power of a trusted voice. All interpretations are based on publicly available information. This content does not make medical or diagnostic claims, nor does it speculate beyond established evidence.
If you'd like to keep exploring cases like this, there's another one waiting for you on screen. I think you'll find it meaningful. Click on it, and thank you for watching.